Welcome to Faith in Five with Cecil and Cecil. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we're so glad that you're here to fellowship with us.
Welcome to Faith in Five. I believe this is going to be episode 20. This is the series where we look at the book Bible questions and answers that was put together that my granddad, C3's dad, Cecil Jr., put together. And it's questions that he answered through a newsletter called the Magnolia Messenger. Last week, we talked about, we actually both answered the question. There's a couple pages here. We answered the question, is it essential that Christians fast, or is it optional? Does fasting provide more spiritual power and strength? So what we're doing with this, if you haven't listened to any of these, we're asking ourselves the question without having read the answer. And then we actually read the answer on the next week, which is this week. So we're going to kind of look at Cecil Jr.'s answer and maybe compare it to some of the things that we had to say. So just as a quick recap, we both basically said that it's not necessarily essential, and that it does provide some power and strength in some circumstances that we've seen. And I gave some probably more practical, unbiblical examples of how it may relate to health. And then you had some things too that were more biblically based and why people fasted and what the thought process was, and that was just kind of their culture as well. So anything you want to add to that before we look at Cecil Jr.'s answer?
Well, I would just, a couple of things that I said last week was, I don't remember Dad ever fasting, and that if he did fast, he's the sort of person who, according to Scripture, you might not have known he was fasting, because that's the way that Jesus said to do it. So those were a couple of things that I threw in there, besides trying to give some of the guess what. Well, I don't really try to guess what his answers would be. I give my answer, and then the next week we see how close it is to his answer.
Yeah, and I think you wanted to mention maybe that you had found out later after that last podcast that he had fasted at some point.
Yes. So our sister Betty, who watches these podcasts, saw the one where we talked about fasting. And so she said, even though I said, I don't recall my dad ever fasting, she said that she asked him one time if he ever fasted. And he had during his late college, early preaching years. And specifically, he mentioned that a professor that he had, he learned a lot about a preacher's devotional life. And he did that in accordance with some devotion that he was doing at that time. So he did practice it at least some in his life.
Does make me wonder some of the things that was going on with him, because I think he had some interesting things to say. This is a longer answer, so I'm not going to read all of it. There is like 2 or 3 sentences at the end where it's kind of a summary, but I did want to point out a couple of things. He starts out just saying, Jesus nowhere commands his followers to fast, which leaves fasting, in some sense at least, optional. He does say, however, in Matthew and Mark and Luke has some parallels. Jesus seems to imply that there would be circumstances under which Christians will fast. Disciples of John came to Jesus and inquired. Anyway, so he goes on to kind of talk about that. I thought the first sentence in the second paragraph was interesting. It says, Jesus here implies, number one, fasting is associated with mourning. And then number two, when Jesus is present with his disciples, is not appropriate time for them to be mourning. So anyway, I thought that those were kind of, he wanted to feast with his disciples a lot of times. They had meals together. But then he also points out that fasting does often seem to be associated with some type of mourning, which I guess biblically I've always seen fasting as, that people are using it as a sacrifice and to ask for something. And I guess, David does this some in times of mourning. Jesus did it some, I guess, obviously thinking about it now in times of mourning. But I thought that was a good observation. Maybe it's more obvious to some people than others, but it had not been obvious to me really until I read that. So I thought that was an interesting thing. Anything you want to say about that before I point out a couple more things?
Well, just in a little bit of research I did about fasting, I learned that in the days of the early church, where in cultures where fasting was done for religious reasons, what Jesus said about he answered the question of the disciples of John, why aren't you fasting? Well, because I'm here, and you don't fast when the bridegroom is here. Uh, I noticed that people who did extended fasts early in Christianity did not fast on Sunday, because Sunday is a day for rejoicing in the resurrection of Jesus.
Mm.
And so fasting did not apply on Sunday. Sunday is the Lord's day, and a happy day, a day of joy, day of resurrection. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, that is.
Even if we're fasting for one reason or another, there are times of joy when it's not appropriate.
Yeah, that's good. He does have a whole section on here about the value of fasting, and so there is some value to it. But I'm just going to go ahead and then just read the summary that we talked about us closing with here. It says, in summary, if one is in deep distress or sorrow, fasting may be a natural response. If it is done deliberately for spiritual benefit, it can be an effective aid to prayer. When it is done, it should be done without intent to make a show. So that's kind of the whole summary of what he talked about in this fairly lengthy answer, which kind of gives me some thoughts on, there is a lot there to cover when talking about fasting. So anything else you want to close with? I think there was one other thing I maybe wanted to say I'm going to try to think about, but anything else you wanted to cover?
I would just say that as I remember it, you and I both hit pretty well on what his answer would be about it not being essential. But it is, as he said, it's a response to a circumstance, and so not essential, but a response to a circumstance, and a healthy one. So I think you and I both said those things when we were giving our answer.
I think probably the book of the Bible I've read the most in my life has been Isaiah. And I think that probably came from being asked one time when I was younger to read a certain scripture before the Lord's Supper. And then I've just always gone back to Isaiah. I think he's an interesting prophet. I think that, to me at least, especially early in younger years, it was the most clear prophecy of Christ to come. So I've just always really enjoyed it. So I'm going to read this one thing from Isaiah that Granddad pointed out here. It says, Isaiah says the people of his day fasted, but while they were fasting, they continued to cheat the poor and engage in strife and all kinds of wickedness. The fast God desires, Isaiah says, is loosening the bonds of wickedness, letting the oppressed go free, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and bringing the homeless into your house. And that's Isaiah 58, 3-9 is how he summarized that. So I thought that was a really good summary of those verses, and just makes me happy to end with that, with my favorite book of the Bible, to read something from that this week that's associated with Granddad as well.
Yep, and it shows us where God is. God says, you want to fast? Why don't you try fasting from wickedness and oppressing the poor?
Yeah. So that's a good point too. There's maybe more than one way to fast. We were talking about going without food, but you can fast from other things as well. So let's stay away from the wickedness. I like that. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. Anything else?
No, that's it.
All right. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Mm-hmm.